The massive palace of the Dragon Emperor floated among the stars, a crystalline fortress that sparkled against the darkness of space. Inside its grand halls, servants from 100 conquered worlds moved silently, their heads bowed in submission. Among them was a human woman named Sarah Chun, captured 3 years ago when the Dragon Empire destroyed Earth colony on Mars. Sarah pushed her cleaning cart through the endless corridors, her brown hair tied back in the simple style required of all servants. The dragon guards paid her no attention. To them, she was just another inferior species, barely worth noticing. They had no idea that beneath her submissive appearance, Sarah carried knowledge that would change everything. The Dragon Emperor Carthax ruled over 17 star systems with absolute power. His species, the Draconians, stood 12 feet tall with scales that shimmered like liquid metal and eyes that burned with inner fire. They possessed technology far beyond anything humans had achieved, with ships that could fold space and weapons that could shatter planets. But their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness, their complete certainty that no other species could ever challenge them. Sarah had learned their language quickly, though she pretended to understand only basic commands. She listened to the guards talk about military movements, overheard discussions about new weapons, and memorized the layout of every section she was allowed to clean. 3 years of patient observation had taught her more about the Dragon Empire than any human spy could have learned. Tonight was different. Tonight, the Emperor would host a gathering of his war council to plan the final conquest of the remaining free worlds. Sarah had been assigned to serve drinks in the council chamber, a task usually given only to the most trusted servants. The overseer who assigned her probably thought he was punishing her with the stress of serving the highest-ranking Draconians. He had no idea he was giving her exactly what she needed. As Sarah prepared the ceremonial drinks in the kitchen, she thought about the small device hidden in her quarters. It was no bigger than a coin, built from scraps she had collected over months of careful planning. The Draconians never searched servant quarters because they couldn't imagine any lesser species having the intelligence to build anything dangerous. Their arrogance would be their downfall. The other servants in the kitchen moved around her like ghosts, each lost in their own misery. There was Tekvar from the water world of Aquaria, his blue skin dry and cracking from the ship's atmosphere. Next to him worked Zara, a feathered being from the forest moon of Sylvanus, her wings clipped to prevent flight. They had all lost their worlds to the Dragon Empire, but unlike Sarah, they had also lost hope. "You serve in council chamber tonight." The kitchen overseer growled in broken common, the simple language used to communicate with servants. "You spill anything, you die. You look at Emperor wrong, you die. You breathe too loud, you die. Understand?" Sarah bowed deeply, keeping her eyes on the floor. "Yes, master. This servant understands." The overseer snorted, smoke curling from his nostrils. "Humans. Weak species. Surprised you last this long." He turned away, already dismissing her from his mind. Sarah carefully arranged the drinks on the floating tray, each goblet filled with the fermented starfire wine that Draconians prized. The tray would follow her automatically, maintaining perfect balance no matter how she moved. She had practiced with these trays for weeks, learning exactly how they worked, understanding their limitations. As she walked toward the council chamber, Sarah passed through sections of the palace she had only seen from afar. The walls here were made of living crystal that sang with harmonic frequencies, creating an atmosphere of power and majesty. Holographic displays showed the Dragon Empire's territory expanding across the galaxy like a disease, consuming system after system. She paused at a viewing port, looking out at the stars. Somewhere among those distant lights, human ships still fought. The remnants of Earth's fleet, along with allies from other conquered worlds, continued to resist. They called themselves the Free Alliance, and, though they were vastly outnumbered, they refused to surrender. Sarah's mission tonight would give them the chance they desperately needed. The guards at the council chamber entrance were elite Draconians, their scales black as space with red highlights that pulsed with their heartbeats. They towered over Sarah, their weapons capable of vaporizing her in seconds. One of them looked down at her with contempt. "Servant," he rumbled, "you have authorization?" Sarah held up the crystal pendant that marked her as assigned to this duty. The guard scanned it with a device on his wrist, then stepped aside. Enter. Touch nothing but serving tray. Speak to no one unless commanded. The council chamber took Sarah's breath away, though she was careful not to show it. The circular room was enormous, with a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time map of the galaxy. Dozens of high-ranking Draconians sat at a crescent-shaped table, their scales reflecting the starlight from above. At the center, on a throne that seemed carved from a single massive gem, sat Emperor Carthax himself. The Emperor was ancient even by Draconian standards, his scales dulled to a deep bronze with age. But his eyes burned brighter than any star, and power radiated from him in waves that Sarah could almost feel. This was the being who had ordered the destruction of entire civilizations, who had enslaved billions, who believed his species destined to rule all life in the galaxy. Sarah moved along the edge of the room, her tray following obediently. She served each Draconian in turn, keeping her movements smooth and efficient. Not one of them looked at her directly. To them, she was furniture, no more worthy of attention than the chair they sat on. As she served, she listened. The Draconians spoke freely, confident that no servant could understand their complex language with its multiple tonal variations and subsonic harmonics. But Sarah understood every word. The Free Alliance grows desperate, General Vorkon was saying, his scarred face twisted in a sneer. Our spies report they plan a major offensive within the next lunar cycle. Let them come, another commander laughed. Their ships are held together with hope and prayer. Our fleet will crush them like insects. Emperor Carthax raised one clawed hand, and silence fell instantly. When he spoke, his voice resonated with absolute authority. Do not underestimate desperation, General. A cornered animal fights hardest. Tell me of their numbers. Sarah moved closer, refilling empty goblets. The tactical discussion that followed revealed everything: fleet positions, weapon capabilities, planned attack routes. The Draconians intended to let the Free Alliance commit to their offensive, then spring a trap that would destroy them utterly. After that, nothing would stand between the Dragon Empire and total galactic domination. What are the humans? A younger Draconian asked. Their world is conquered, but their ships fight harder than any others. The Emperor's laugh was like grinding stone. Humans are chaos made flesh. They fight without strategy, without honor. But chaos cannot stand against order. When we destroy their last ships, their species will accept servitude, as all others have. Sarah's hand remained steady as she poured wine, but inside, rage burned hot as any dragon fire. She thought of Earth, its cities in ruins, its people scattered. She thought of her brother, who had died defending the Mars colony. She thought of every human who still fought among the stars, refusing to bow to these monsters. The meeting continued for hours. Sarah memorized every detail, every piece of intelligence that could help the Free Alliance. But, more importantly, she waited for the perfect moment. The device in her quarters wasn't a weapon. It was something far more dangerous. It was a transmitter designed to send a single burst of information across vast distances. The Draconians' own communication network would carry the signal, hidden in the background noise of routine palace operations. As the meeting wound down, Emperor Carthax called for a final toast. To the Dragon Empire, he declared, raising his goblet. May our reign last until the stars themselves burn cold. The other Draconians raised their drinks, their voices joining in the traditional response. This was the moment Sarah had waited for. As she moved to refill the Emperor's goblet one last time, she stumbled slightly. It was a tiny thing, barely noticeable, but it brought her within arm's reach of the Emperor's throne. The throne was the center of the palace's power network, connecting to every system, every defense, every weapon. And for just 1 second, Sarah's hand brushed against its base. The contact was so brief that the guards didn't even tense. But it was enough. The tiny device she had sewn into her palm, no larger than a grain of sand, made contact with the throne's surface. Using technology salvaged from destroyed human ships and, modified over months of careful work, it burrowed into the throne's crystalline structure. Within seconds, it had interfaced with the palace's central network. Sarah straightened, bowing in apology for her clumsiness. The Emperor didn't even look at her. No one suspected anything. How could they? In their minds, humans were barely intelligent enough to clean floors, let alone create technology that could infiltrate their most secure systems. The rest of the service passed without incident. Sarah collected the empty goblets, cleaned the table, and departed with the same invisible efficiency she had displayed for 3 years. The guards barely glanced at her as she left. Back in the kitchen, Sarah returned the serving equipment and retreated to the servant quarters. Her small cell was bare except for a sleeping mat and a single shelf for her few possessions. But hidden beneath a loose floor panel was the transmitter she had built, waiting for the signal from the device she had planted. Sarah sat on her mat and waited. Around her, the palace continued its normal operations. Guards changed shifts, servants prepared for the next day's work, and the Dragon Empire's leadership retired to their quarters, satisfied with their plans for final victory. They had no idea that in a few hours, everything would change. The device in the throne worked slowly, carefully, designed to avoid triggering any security protocols. It mapped the palace's defenses, recorded communication frequencies, and, most importantly, accessed the Dragon Empire's tactical database. Every fleet position, every weapon specification, every planned military operation, all of it flowed through the throne's network. As midnight approached, Sarah felt the transmitter in her hiding spot warm slightly. The device had completed its work and was ready to send. Sarah carefully extracted the transmitter and held it in her hands. Such a small thing to carry such enormous consequences. She thought of the Free Alliance ships hiding in nebulas and asteroid fields, their crews exhausted from years of running and fighting. She thought of the colony worlds still holding out against dragon rule, their people praying for a miracle. She thought of every servant in this palace, every enslaved soul who had given up hope. "This is for all of us," she whispered, and activated the transmitter. The signal burst lasted less than a second, too fast for the palace's security systems to trace. But in that second, terabytes of information streamed across space, riding the Dragon Empire's own communication network. The signal would reach Free Alliance receivers within hours, carrying intelligence that would change everything. Sarah quickly dismantled the transmitter, crushing its components into powder and flushing them down the waste disposal. The device in the throne would self-destruct in a few hours, leaving no trace of its existence. By then, it would be too late. She lay down on her mat, finally, allowing herself a small smile. The Draconians believed they were gods among lesser beings, invincible in their superiority. Tomorrow, they would begin to learn the truth that humans might be chaos made flesh, but chaos, properly directed, could bring down empires. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, she heard the faint sound of the palace's night cycle beginning. Lights dimmed in the corridors, and the great fortress settled into its routine quiet. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But in the darkness between stars, Free Alliance communication officers were already picking up an impossible signal. Encrypted data streams filled their screens, carrying intelligence beyond their wildest hopes. Admirals were being woken from sleep, emergency meetings called, and for the first time in years, hope spread through the ragged fleet like wildfire. The Dragon Emperor slept in his magnificent chamber, surrounded by treasures looted from 100 worlds. He dreamed of the day when every star in the galaxy would shine on worlds under his rule. He dreamed of order, control, and eternal dominion. He did not dream of the human servant who had stood within arm's reach of him just hours before. He did not dream of the device slowly deleting itself in his throne. He did not dream of the Free Alliance fleet already beginning to move, armed with knowledge that would let them turn his trap against him. And he certainly did not dream that his empire's downfall had begun not with great battles or mighty heroes, but with a quiet woman pushing a cleaning cart through his halls, listening learning, and waiting for her moment. The stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the affairs of mortals. But among those stars, change was coming. The Dragon Empire had ruled through fear and superiority for centuries. They had never faced an enemy who understood them, who knew their weaknesses, who could use their own strength against them. Sarah Chun had given humanity and its allies that understanding. Now it remained to be seen what they would do with it. In the servant quarters, others began to stir. Word would spread, as it always did among the oppressed. The human woman who cleaned the halls had done something, though none knew what. Some felt in the air, a change, a shift, a sense that the universe had tilted slightly on its axis. Tekvar, the water worlder, found himself thinking of home for the first time in months. Zara stretched her clipped wings, wondering if she might fly again someday. Throughout the palace, servants who had accepted their fate began to remember what it felt like to hope. None of them knew that in just 3 days, the largest space battle in galactic history would be fought. They didn't know that the Free Alliance, armed with perfect intelligence, would turn the Dragon Fleet's ambush into a rout. They didn't know that the myth of draconian invincibility would be shattered forever. But they sensed something. In the way Sarah walked the next morning, her back a little straighter. In the way she met their eyes and smiled just slightly. In the way the universe itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The Dragon Empire had made many mistakes in its long history, but perhaps the greatest was this. They assumed that strength could only be measured in scales and fire in fleets and weapons. They never understood that true strength sometimes came in quieter forms, in patience, in intelligence, in the determination of those who had lost everything but refused to surrender. Sarah Chun resumed her duties the next day as if nothing had changed. She pushed her cart through the corridors, cleaned the floors, and remained invisible to her overlords. But she carried with her the knowledge that she had struck a blow for freedom that would echo across the stars. The Draconians would learn, too late, that they should have paid attention to the servant with the cleaning cart. They should have wondered why humans fought so hard when logic dictated surrender. They should have recognized that chaos wasn't their enemy, underestimating it was. As Sarah worked, she heard the first rumors among the guards. Communication issues with some outer fleet positions. Nothing serious, probably just stellar interference. She kept her expression carefully neutral, but inside she smiled. It had begun. The human servant had acted, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same. 3 days had passed since Sarah Chun planted the device in the Emperor's throne. The palace continued its routine, but subtle changes rippled through the corridors like tremors before an earthquake. Guards whispered about communication blackouts with border fleets. Officers hurried through hallways with worried expressions. The perfect order of the Dragon Empire showed its first cracks. Sarah maintained her routine, careful to display no sign of her involvement. She cleaned the same halls, served in the same kitchens, and kept her head bowed in the presence of her masters. But she watched everything, noting the growing tension among the Draconians. In the servant quarters, the atmosphere had shifted. Where once there was only despair, now there were questions. Servants who hadn't spoken in months began whispering to each other. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel the fear growing in their captors. Something wrong with dragons, Tekvar murmured to Sarah as they prepared the morning meal. His broken comment carried a note of wonder. They worry. Never seen dragons worry before. Sarah shrugged, keeping her expression neutral. Master's business, not ours. She replied in the same broken speech they were expected to use. Inside, her heart raced. The Free Alliance must have received the intelligence and begun their operations. The kitchen overseer stormed in, his scales flickering with agitation. Work faster, he snarled. High command meeting today. Everything must be perfect. He grabbed a younger servant who had dropped a plate, shaking the terrified creature. Mistakes mean death today. Understand. After he left, Sarah helped the shaken servant to their feet. It was of Rex, a 6-limbed being from a jungle world conquered decades ago. Thank you, it whispered, its compound eyes reflecting gratitude. We help each other, Sarah said simply. It was a radical statement in a place where survival usually meant keeping your head down and caring only for yourself. But things were changing. The emergency meeting was held in the same council chamber where Sarah had planted the device. She wasn't assigned to serve this time. The Draconians had called only their most senior servants, those who had served for decades without incident. But Sarah found ways to listen. She cleaned the adjoining corridors, moving slowly, ears straining to catch fragments of raised voices through the walls. What she heard made her suppress a smile. The Free Alliance hadn't just used the intelligence to avoid the trap. They had turned it into a devastating counterattack. 3 major dragon fleets had been caught separated from each other, expecting to close on scattered Alliance forces. Instead, they had found themselves facing the entire combined Alliance fleet, perfectly positioned to defeat them piecemeal. Impossible, she heard General Vorkon roar. They knew exactly where we would be. They knew our formations, our timing, everything. We have a spy, another voice said coldly. Sarah recognized it as Admiral Esikator, head of Imperial Intelligence. Someone with access to our highest security networks. Someone who has been among us, unseen. Emperor Carthax's voice cut through the debate like a blade. Find him. Search every system, every communication, every breath taken in this palace. I want the traitor found and brought before me. Sarah finished cleaning the corridor and moved on, her mind racing. The search would be thorough, but she had been careful. The device had left no traces, and nothing connected her to the transmission. Still, she would need to be even more cautious now. Over the following days, the palace transformed into a fortress of paranoia. Security screenings tripled. Servants were questioned under truth scanners, though the devices were calibrated for draconian physiology and gave unreliable results with other species. Guard patrols increased, and sudden searches became common. Sarah endured it all with the same quiet submission she had shown for 3 years. When guards burst in her cell at midnight, she cowered appropriately. When they scattered her few possessions searching for contraband, she thanked them for their thoroughness. When the truth scanners failed to work properly on her human nervous system, she appeared too simple to be hiding anything. But the real protection came from the Draconians' own prejudices. As the security chief reviewed the list of palace personnel with access to sensitive areas, he dismissed whole categories without consideration. The Vreks are too primitive, he declared. Their minds can barely comprehend basic technology. The Aquarians are physically incapable of the precise movements required. The Sylvans are too broken by captivity. And the humans, he laughed. Humans can barely learn to clean floors properly. The idea of one of them understanding our systems is absurd. His subordinates agreed readily. After all, everyone knew that Draconians were the supreme intelligence in the galaxy. The lesser races served because that was all they were capable of. The spy must be a Draconian traitor, or perhaps a member of one of the more advanced servant species. Sarah wasn't the only human in the palace, but she was one of the few who had survived more than a year of service. Humans, the Draconians had learned, were prone to what they called irrational resistance. They would work obediently for months, then, suddenly, attack a guard with a kitchen knife or attempt some hopeless sabotage. These incidents always ended in death, reinforcing the Draconian belief that humans were unstable primitives. What they didn't understand was that these weren't acts of madness, but calculated sacrifices. Each incident drew attention and security resources while other humans observed and learned. Sarah had learned more from watching her fellow humans die than from any other source. Their sacrifices had shown her which systems were critical, which guards were easily distracted, which areas had security gaps. A week after the disastrous battle, the palace received news that sent shockwaves through the dragon hierarchy. The Free Alliance hadn't just won a tactical victory. They had captured the flagship of the Third Fleet, including its advanced navigation systems and communication codes. Worse, they seemed to know exactly how to use the capture technology. Sarah was serving water to a group of junior officers when she heard the details. The Alliance had used the captured codes to send false orders to dragon colonies, creating chaos in supply lines. They had extracted the locations of secret military bases from the navigation systems. Most impossibly, they had managed to partially decode the Dragon Empire's quantum encryption, something that should have taken centuries of effort. They had help, one officer insisted. No primitive alliance could achieve this alone. Someone taught them our weaknesses. His companion nodded grimly. The Emperor has ordered the execution of 10 servants from each species as an example. Perhaps fear will make the traitor reveal themselves. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she poured water, the first sign of emotion she had shown in years. 10 humans would die because of her actions. 10 innocent people who had no knowledge of what she had done. The weight of it pressed down on her like a mountain. That night, she lay awake thinking, had she done the right thing? The intelligence she provided would save millions of lives across the galaxy, but these 10 humans would die tomorrow because of her choice. In war, such calculations were necessary, but that didn't make them easier to bear. The executions were held in the palace's central courtyard, a vast space usually reserved for ceremonies. All servants were required to attend, standing in silent rows while their fellow slaves were brought forward. Sarah stood with the other humans, her face carefully blank as 10 of her species were lined up before the assembled crowd. They were a mix of ages and backgrounds, a young woman who had worked in the laundry, an older man from the engine rooms, others Sarah had seen but never spoken to. They stood straight, refusing to bow or beg. Even facing death, they maintained their dignity. Emperor Carthax himself presided over the execution, his massive form radiating cold fury. Let this be a lesson, his voice boomed across the courtyard. Betrayal will be met with death. The guilty will be found, and they will suffer far worse than these. But until then, blood pays for blood. The execution was swift, dragon energy weapons that reduced their victims to atoms in seconds. One moment 10 humans stood defiant, the next only empty space remained. Around the courtyard, hundreds of servants stood in enforced silence, but Sarah could feel their anger like heat from a forge. That night, something changed in the servant quarters. The random executions had been meant to create fear and division, to make each species suspect the others. Instead, it had the opposite effect. For the first time in decades, servants from different worlds began to truly communicate. It started small, a shared piece of food, a word of comfort in broken common. But it grew. Tekvar the Aquarian used his people's ability to sense electromagnetic fields to warn others of approaching guards. Zara the Sylvan taught others her species' meditation techniques to withstand interrogation. The Vrex shared their knowledge of which plants in the palace gardens could be used for medicine. Sarah became a quiet center of this growing network. Her human gift for adaptation and pattern recognition made her a natural coordinator. She never gave orders or revealed her true capabilities, but somehow plans formed around her suggestions, and resources found their way to those who needed them. Meanwhile, the war outside continued to shift. The Free Alliance, emboldened by their victories and armed with inside knowledge, struck at targets the Dragon Empire had thought secret and safe. Supply depots burned. Communication relays fell silent. Shipyards that had built warships for centuries were reduced to debris. Most disturbing to the Draconians was how the Alliance fought. They didn't engage in the formal fleet battles that had defined warfare for millennia. Instead, they struck like humans, with chaos, creativity, and complete disregard for traditional tactics. They used captured dragon technology in ways its creators had never imagined. They turned merchant ships into surprise attackers and made weapons for mining equipment. They fight without honor. General Vorkon raged during another emergency meeting that Sarah overheard while cleaning nearby. They refuse to face us properly. They strike and vanish like smoke. You mean they fight to win? Admiral Esikator observed coldly. Something has changed in their thinking. They no longer fight like prey trying to escape. They fight like predators learning to hunt. The Emperor's response was a wordless roar of fury that shook the palace walls. Sarah smiled grimly as she pushed her cart away. The Draconians were learning what humans had always known. In a fight for survival, There was no such thing as unfair tactics. 3 weeks after the first battle, the palace received its worst news yet. A dragon colony world had fallen, not to bombardment or invasion, but to slave revolt. The servants on Crexiar had somehow overwhelmed their masters, taking control of the planetary defense systems and declaring their independence. When the dragon fleet arrived to retake the world, they found their own weapons turned against them. The how of it seemed impossible. Servant species weren't allowed education, weren't permitted to understand technology. But somehow they had not only operated complex systems but improved them. The planetary shields that should have fallen in hours held for days. Weapons that should have been silent saying death to dragon ships. Sarah knew how, though she had played no direct role. The network she had helped create in the palace extended far beyond these walls. Servants throughout the empire had been teaching each other, sharing knowledge, preparing. The execution of innocents had been the spark that lit a fire already laid. The Draconians responded with predictable brutality. They glassed Crexiar from orbit, turning a garden world into molten rock. But the message had already spread. On a dozen worlds, servants looked at their masters and saw not gods, but mortal creatures who could bleed and die. In the palace, security reached paranoid levels. Servants were locked in their quarters when not working. Food was rationed to starvation levels. Any gathering of more than 2 servants brought immediate punishment. But the network adapted, evolved, grew stronger. Messages passed in the movement of mops across floors. Plans were discussed in the harmonics of work songs. The Vrex, with their compound eyes, could watch a dozen directions at once and signal danger with subtle shifts in posture. The Aquarians' ability to sense bioelectric fields let them detect the emotional states of guards, warning when violence was near. And the humans? The humans did what they did best. They survived, adapted, and remembered everything. Sarah began to notice other humans watching her, not with suspicion, but with recognition. Somehow they knew, not the specifics of what she had done, but that she was important to whatever was happening. They began to help in small ways, creating distractions when she needed to be somewhere, taking blame for minor infractions to keep her above suspicion. One evening, as Sarah returned to her cell, she found a small object hidden beneath her sleeping mat. It was a data chip, so small she almost missed it. Her heart raced as she palmed it, wondering who had left it and why. Later, when the corridors were silent, she examined it. The chip contained a single message in Alliance code. Dawn comes. Be ready. Your brothers and sisters have not forgotten. Sarah destroyed the chip immediately, but the message burned in her mind. The Free Alliance was coming here, to the heart of the Dragon Empire. It seemed impossible. The palace's defenses were impregnable, its location secret. But then, many impossible things had happened lately. The next day brought news that explained the message. The Dragon Empire's vaunted intelligence network had been compromised. Dozens of deep cover agents had been exposed and captured, their covers blown by information that could only have come from inside the Empire itself. More disturbing, the agents had been turned, fed false information for months before their discovery. They play our own game against us, Admiral Essicator reported to a gathering Sarah observed while serving. Every strength we possessed has become a weakness. Our rigid command structure lets them predict our responses. Our advanced technology becomes a trap when they learn its vulnerabilities. Our certainty in our superiority blinds us to threats. Then, we must change, the Emperor declared. Become unpredictable. Think like the animals we fight. But Draconians couldn't change their nature any more than stars could change their courses. They were what evolution and culture had made them, powerful, intelligent, but ultimately inflexible. They had built their empire on absolute order and couldn't abandon it without abandoning themselves. Sarah watched them struggle with grim satisfaction. Every adaptation they attempted was half-hearted, filtered through assumptions they couldn't abandon. They tried to be unpredictable, but in predictably systematic ways. They attempted flexibility, but within rigid parameters. They were dragons trying to be chameleons and failing at both. The servant network, meanwhile, grew more sophisticated daily. What had begun as simple mutual aid evolved into something approaching an intelligence service. Servants who worked in communication centers memorized fragments of messages. Those in maintenance learned which systems were critical. Kitchen workers noted which foods went to which officers, building profiles of the command structure. All of this information flowed through hidden channels, pooling in the minds of those clever enough to assemble the pieces. Sarah was one such node, but far from the only one. The Draconians had created the perfect spy network by bringing together beings from across the galaxy and treating them as furniture. Every servant had become eyes and ears for the rebellion. Then came a night when everything accelerated. Sarah was cleaning the throne room, now under heavy guard since the Emperor had learned his throne had been compromised, when alarms began screaming. Not the measured tones of a drill, but the harsh wail of immediate danger. Guards ran through the corridors, their usual discipline shattered. Sarah pressed against a wall, making herself invisible as officers sprinted past. She caught fragments of shouted orders, breached the outer perimeter. Impossible, the shields, already in the system. The Free Alliance hadn't just come. They had somehow penetrated the palace's legendary defenses. As Sarah watched from the shadows, she saw something that made her heart soar. Among the rushing guards were figures that moved wrong, their gait not quite matching draconian physiology despite wearing their armor. The Alliance had infiltrated the palace. Sarah's mind raced. This was the moment the message had warned her about. Dawn was coming, and she needed to be ready. But ready for what? What role was she to play in whatever was about to unfold? She got her answer when a hand fell on her shoulder. Sarah spun, ready to fight or flee, but stopped when she saw who had touched her. It was another human, but not one of the palace servants. This woman wore the pieced-together armor of a Free Alliance Marine, her face scarred by battle, but her eyes bright with purpose. "Sarah Chun?" the Marine asked quietly. Sarah nodded, too stunned to speak. "Captain Maria Santos, Alliance Intelligence. We're here because of you. The information you sent saved the fleet and gave us this chance." She smiled fiercely. "Now it's time to finish what you started. What do you need me to do?" "The Emperor will retreat to his panic room soon. It's designed to withstand any assault, but you know this palace. You know its secrets. Help us find another way." Sarah thought rapidly. The panic room was indeed impregnable from the outside, but she had cleaned every corner of this palace, had listened to every careless word. She knew things the builders had never intended anyone to know. "There's a maintenance shaft," she said. "It carries the palace's water recycling system. Too small for a draconian, but perfect for a human," Santos finished. "Show me." As Sarah led the Marine through servant passages, the palace shook with the sound of battle. The Free Alliance hadn't come with a massive fleet that would have been detected. Instead, they had used the intelligence Sarah provided to slip a small, elite force through gaps in the defenses. Now that force was turning the palace into a battlefield. But the real battle was happening in the servant quarters. The network Sarah had helped build activated in full. Servants who had seemed broken suddenly remembered skills from their free lives. Engineers sabotaged critical systems. Medics ensured wounded Draconians received the wrong treatments. Cooks poisoned food supplies. The Draconians, faced with threats from without and within, fell into chaos. Their rigid command structure collapsed as officers gave contradictory orders. Guards abandoned posts to protect their own quarters. The perfect order of the Dragon Empire shattered like glass. Sarah and Santos reached the maintenance shaft just as another group of Marines caught up with them. Among them were beings from a dozen species: humans, Aquarians, Vrex, even a few Sylvans with mechanical wings to replace those cut by their captors. "The Emperor's holed up in his panic room," Santos reported. "Chun here knows a way in." Sarah showed them the shaft entrance, hidden behind what appeared to be solid wall. The water recycling leads directly into the panic room's life support. The designers never thought anyone would use sewage pipes as an attack route. "Because Draconians would never crawl through waste," one of the Marines laughed. "But humans? We've done worse to win." Santos organized quickly. Delta Team, you're with us through the pipes. Gamma Team, hold this position. Everyone else, continue the primary assault. Make noise, keep them focused on the main attack. Sarah started to step back, but Santos caught her arm. You're coming with us, Chun. You've earned the right to see this through. They crawled through darkness and filth, the pipes barely wide enough for human shoulders. Sarah led the way, navigating by memory and touch. Behind her, she could hear the Marines' steady breathing, their discipline evident even in these conditions. The sounds of battle echoed strangely through the pipes, distant explosions, the whine of energy weapons, screams in a dozen languages. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, Sarah found what she was looking for, a grating that led into the panic room's water processing unit. She could hear voices beyond, including the distinctive harmonics of the Emperor himself. Santos produced a small cutting tool, slicing through the grate with silent efficiency. One by one, the Marines slipped through into a small maintenance chamber adjacent to the main panic room. Through another grate, Sarah could see the Emperor and his inner circle, perhaps 20 Draconians in all. 12 guards, 8 officials, Santos whispered, analyzing the situation with professional ease. Heavy weapons, but they're all facing the main door. They expect a frontal assault. The Emperor's throne, Sarah pointed out. It's a backup command center. If he reaches it, he can trigger the palace self-destruct. Santos smiled coldly. Then, we make sure he doesn't reach it. The attack was swift and brutal. Marines burst from the maintenance chamber, catching the Draconians completely off guard. Energy weapons fired in the confined space, turning the air into a light show of death. The Draconians, for all their strength and technology, were warriors trained for honorable combat. They didn't know how to fight enemies who appeared from sewage pipes, who used furniture as shields, who fought with the desperate creativity of those who had nothing left to lose. Sarah found herself in the middle of the chaos, armed with a weapon taken from a fallen guard. She had never killed before, had spent 3 years in perfect submission. But now, facing the beings who had destroyed her world and enslaved her people, she felt no hesitation. The battle was brief, but vicious. When the smoke cleared, only the Emperor remained standing, backed against his throne. His scales had lost their luster, and for the first time, he looked old. Around him lay his inner circle, the architects of 1,000 atrocities. You dare, he rumbled, his voice still carrying traces of its old power. Lesser beings, slaves, you dare raise weapons against your gods. Santos stepped forward, her weapon trained on the Emperor's head. You know, God, you're just another tyrant who confused power with divinity. She glanced at Sarah. Chun, would you like to do the honors? Sarah moved forward, meeting the Emperor's burning gaze without flinching. You were wrong about humans, she said quietly. We're not chaos made flesh. We're adaptation itself. You created the perfect conditions for your own downfall. You brought together beings from across the galaxy, taught us your weaknesses, and gave us a common enemy. The Emperor's laugh was bitter. Kill me then, human. Another will take my place. The Dragon Empire is eternal. No, Sarah said simply. It's already dead. It died the moment you stopped seeing us as threats. Your empire will fall not because we're stronger, but because you never believed we could be. She pulled the trigger. Emperor Carthax, ruler of 17 systems, terror of the galaxy, fell like any other mortal being. His death triggered no magical collapse, no dramatic transformation. He simply died, proving what the servants had learned. Their masters were flesh and blood, nothing more. The battle for the palace continued for hours, but the outcome was never in doubt after the Emperor's death. Demoralized Draconians surrendered or fled. Servants rose throughout the structure, turning their intimate knowledge of palace operations against their former masters. By dawn, true dawn, with the local star rising over the horizon, the fortress that had symbolized dragon power had fallen. Sarah stood on a balcony, watching the sun rise. Her clothes were filthy, her hands stained with blood, and worse, but she felt clean for the first time in 3 years. Around her, freed servants embraced, cried, celebrated. Ships bearing Free Alliance markings descended from the sky, bringing medical aid and food. Captain Santos found her there. "The war's not over," she said gently. "There are still dragon fleets out there, still occupied worlds. But this—" She gestured at the liberated palace. "This changes everything. The myth is broken. The Empire will fall apart from within now." Sarah nodded. "What happens to us? The servants? Whatever you want. Return to your homes if they still exist. Join the Alliance military. Help rebuild. The choice is yours." That's what freedom means. Over the following days, the palace transformed. Former servants took control of systems they had only been allowed to clean. The vast treasuries were opened, looted wealth cataloged for return to its rightful owners. The throne room became a hospital. The council chamber hosted meetings of former slaves planning their futures. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, not by choice but by necessity. She understood the palace systems better than anyone. She could translate between the dozens of languages spoken by former servants. Most importantly, she had become a symbol, the quiet servant who had brought down an empire. Representatives from across the Free Alliance came to meet her. They offered her positions, rewards, anything she wanted. Sarah refused them all. She had done what she set out to do. Now she just wanted to find other human survivors and help rebuild something from the ashes of Earth colonies. But first there was work to finish. The Dragon Empire's databases contained the locations of every slave processing center, every prison world, every forced labor camp. Sarah helped Alliance technicians decode the information, creating a roadmap for liberation. She also found something else in those databases: records of human resistance cells still operating in occupied territory. Her people had never stopped fighting, even after Earth fell. They had simply gone underground, waiting for their moment. Now that moment had come. The palace's communication systems, once used to coordinate oppression, now carried messages of hope. On 100 worlds, beings who had been property learned they were free. The dragon fleets, robbed of their supreme confidence, and facing enemies who knew their every weakness, began to fracture. Some surrendered. Others turned warlord, trying to carve out personal domains. A few fought to the bitter end, unable to accept a universe where they were not supreme. But the outcome was never in doubt after the palace fell. Sarah had proven that the Dragon Empire, for all its power, rested on a foundation of arrogance and assumption. When those were shattered, the entire structure collapsed. On the day she finally left the palace, Sarah paused at the throne room's entrance. The massive chamber, where she had first planted the device, now hosted a celebration of freed beings. The throne itself had been melted down, its rare minerals distributed to help rebuild destroyed worlds. Tekvar found her there. The Aquarian scales had regained their healthy blue sheen now that he could access proper water. "You go," he asked in much improved common. "It's time. There are other humans out there who need help. We not forget," Tekvar said seriously. "Stories will tell of Sarah Chun, the servant who whispered and empires fell." Sarah smiled. "Tell them about all of us. Every servant who kept their dignity, who helped another, who refused to break. We all brought down the empire. I just lit the fuse." As her ship lifted off, Sarah looked back at the palace one last time. It no longer seemed imposing or terrible. It was just a building, one that would be converted to serve life rather than death. The real victory wasn't in its capture, but in what it represented: proof that no tyranny, no matter how powerful, could stand against the united will of those it oppressed. The galaxy was vast, and there was much work ahead. Worlds to rebuild, peoples to reunite, wounds to heal. But for the first time in decades, the stars held promise rather than threat. Sarah Chun, former servant, architect of revolution, settled back in her seat as the ship entered hyperspace. She had started as a woman with a mop and a quiet determination to resist. She had ended as the spark that lit a galactic revolution. Not bad for a member of a species too primitive to understand dragon technology. As the ship jumped to light speed, carrying her toward humanity's scattered remnants, Sarah allowed herself one moment of pure satisfaction. The Emperor had been wrong about everything, but most of all about this, humans weren't chaos. They were hope. And hope, it turned out, was the one thing the Dragon Empire had never learned to fight. 5 years had passed since the fall of the Dragon Palace. The galaxy looked different now. Not perfect, not healed, but free. Where once the Dragon Empire's banners had flown, now 1,000 different flags represented worlds reclaiming their identities. The transformation hadn't been easy or bloodless, but it had been necessary. Sarah Chin stood on the observation deck of the Alliance flagship, Liberation, watching the assembled fleet prepare for what many hoped would be the final major operation of the war. At 38, she carried scars both visible and hidden from her years of struggle. Her hair, once kept short by servant regulations, now fell to her shoulders with premature streaks of silver. Her eyes, though, remained sharp and determined. "Admiral Chun," a voice called. She turned to see Captain Santos, now bearing the rank of general. The years had been kind to the Marine. Combat suited her better than peace ever would. "Maria," Sarah smiled. "I've told you not to call me that. Im no admiral." "The fleet says otherwise," Santos replied. "Like it or not, you're the one they follow. The servant who brought down an empire. The woman who understands both victory and chains." It was true, though Sarah had never sought command. After the palace fell, she had spent months searching for human survivors, helping establish refugee camps, coordinating resistance cells. But wherever she went, beings of all species looked to her for leadership. Former servants especially saw her as their voice, their proof that the powerless could change the galaxy. Eventually, the Free Alliance had simply acknowledged reality and given her the rank to match her influence. Admiral Sarah Chun, commander of the Liberation Fleet. Not the largest force in the Alliance, but the most diverse. Her crews were former servants, escaped prisoners, beings who had lost everything but refused to surrender hope. "The scouts report in?" Sarah asked, shifting to business. "Just arrived. The dragons have holed up in the Carthax system. Appropriate, since it was their first conquest. Best estimates put their strength at 300 ships, mostly holdouts, and supremacists who can't accept the new reality." Sarah studied the tactical display that appeared before them. The Carthax system was a fortress surrounded by automated defenses and minefields. The remaining dragon forces had spent years preparing for this last stand, determined to die rather than live in a galaxy where they were not supreme. "They're going to make us pay for every meter," Sarah observed. "Unless we can convince them to surrender," Santos suggested without much hope. "They won't. These are the true believers, the ones who still think they're gods. They'd rather die than live as equals." Sarah had seen it too many times, dragons who chose death over a universe that no longer bent to their will. It was the final, tragic price of their ingrained superiority complex. A communication officer approached, saluting. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the surface of Carthax Prime. It's marked with servant codes." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Servants? Still alive down there?" "Unknown, ma'am. The message is text only, repeating on a loop. It says, 'The Dawn Walker is remembered. The chains await breaking. The youngest serve the oldest.' Then there's a set of coordinates. Santos Fronid. Could be a trap. Dragons using old servant codes to lure us in." But Sarah shook her head slowly. "Dawn Walker. That's what some of the servants called me after the palace fell. And the youngest served the oldest." Her mind raced through possibilities. "Give me everything we have on Carthax Prime. Original surveys, pre-conquest data, everything." As her staff scrambled to comply, Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the same instinct that had guided her through 3 years of servitude, that had told her when to plant the device, when to act, and when to wait. Something important was happening here. The data, when it came, was revealing. Carthax Prime had been the dragon's first conquest 800 years ago, but before that, it had been home to an ancient civilization. The Primarchs, they were called in the old records. A species that had achieved spaceflight before humans had discovered fire, then mysteriously vanished. The dragons built their first palace on pre-March ruins, the intelligence officer reported. used the ancient foundations, incorporated pre-March technology into their structures. Some archaeologists theorized the dragon's rapid technological advancement came from reverse engineering pre-March artifacts. The youngest serve the oldest, Sarah murmured. The dragons, the youngest of the galaxy's powers, built on the bones of the oldest. She made her decision. Prepare a stealth insertion team. I'm going down there. Admiral, that's not wise. Santos began. It's necessary, Sarah cut her off. If there are servants still alive on that world, I won't abandon them. And if this is connected to the Primarchs. She didn't finish the thought, but the implications hung in the air. Ancient technology in dragon hands had created one empire. In the wrong hands, it could create another. The stealth ship slipped through Carthax's defenses like a whisper through thunder. Dragon sensors, for all their advancement, had blind spots, something Sarah had learned during her years of service. They looked for threats that announced themselves, for enemies who fought with honor. A small ship running silent, using gravity wells and debris fields for cover, could ghost past their watchers. Sarah's team was small, but elite. 2 humans, an Aquarian technical specialist, a Vrek scout with enhanced senses, and a Sylvan pilot whose people had developed space travel through biological rather than mechanical means. Each was a former servant who had proven themselves in the years since liberation. The coordinates led them to a mountain range on Carthax Prime's northern continent. Ancient beyond measure, the peaks had been carved by wind and time into fantastic shapes. But beneath their natural appearance, Sarah's trained eye caught traces of artificial construction. Lines too straight, angles too perfect. Set us down in that canyon, she ordered. Passive sensors only. We go in quiet. The facility they found was a hybrid of pre-March mystery and dragon arrogance. The entrance bore the sealed portal of the Dragon Empire, but the walls around it were older than any dragon structure. Inside, emergency lighting cast long shadows through corridors that seemed to shift between architectural styles, sometimes the brutal efficiency of dragon design, sometimes something far older and more alien. They found the first bodies after just minutes of exploration. Dragons, dead for days or weeks, their scales dulled to gray. But what caught Sarah's attention was how they had died. No wounds, no signs of violence. They had simply stopped, frozen in place like statues. Poison, suggested Crave, one of the human marines. No, the Vrek scout clicked nervously. Death here is strange. Not natural. Not violent. Just ending. They pressed deeper, following emergency markers that still glowed faintly. The facility was massive, extending deep into the mountain. They passed laboratories, barracks, storage rooms, all empty of life, but full of questions. What had the dragons been doing here? And what had killed them? The answer came when they reached the facility's heart. A vast chamber opened before them, clearly pre-March in origin. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to move when viewed directly, and the air hummed with barely contained energy. At the center sat a structure that defied easy description, part machine, part crystal growth, part something that might have been organic eons ago. And arranged around it, in neat rows, were hundreds of beings in servant garb. Sarah's team raised weapons instinctively, but she held up a hand. Wait, look at them. The servants sat in meditation poses, eyes closed, breathing so slowly they barely seemed alive. Every species Sarah had seen in bondage was represented: Aquarians, Vreks, Sylvans, humans, dozens of others. But something was different about them. They seemed connected somehow, as if invisible threads linked each to the others, and all to the strange device at the chamber's center. Admiral, the Aquarian specialist whispered, his bioelectric senses overwhelmed. The energy patterns here, I've never felt anything like it. It's like they're all part of one vast mind. Before Sarah could respond, one of the figures stirred. A human woman, elderly but with eyes that held depths of experience, slowly stood and approached them. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Dawn Walker, she said, we have been waiting for you. Who are you? Sarah asked, not lowering her weapon, but not pointing it either. What is this place? I am Vera Chun, the woman replied, and Sarah's heart stopped. Chun was her family name, though she had found no relatives among the survivors. Your grandmother's sister, taken in the first raids on Mars. As for this place, she gestured to the crystal structure. This is where the dragons learned their power, and where we learned to take it back. Vera led them deeper into the chamber, past the meditating figures. The dragons found this facility when they conquered Carthax. Pre-Mars technology abandoned for millennia. They studied it, learned from it, used it to enhance their abilities and extend their reach across the stars. But they made a mistake. What mistake? Sarah asked, though part of her already knew. They used us to maintain it, Vera smiled coldly. Servants to clean, to repair, to keep their great secret functioning. They never imagined we might learn more than they did. The Primarchs, you see, were not conquerors. They were connectors. Their technology wasn't designed for domination, but for unity. She touched the crystal structure, and it pulsed with soft light. This is a neural harmonizer. It links minds across space and time, allowing perfect communication and understanding. The dragons used it to coordinate their empire, never realizing it could work both ways. Understanding dawned on Sarah. The servant network. It wasn't just organization and whispered messages. You were linked. Some of us, Vera confirmed. Those who worked here learned to access the harmonizer. We touched minds across the empire, sharing knowledge, coordinating resistance. Every piece of intelligence you gathered, every act of sabotage, was part of a pattern we helped weave. But the dragons here are dead, Sarah pointed out. What happened? Vera's expression grew somber. When your message reached the Free Alliance, when the Empire began to fall, the dragons here tried to use the harmonizer as a weapon. They wanted to send a psychic command across the galaxy, forcing all servants to turn on their liberators. But we had learned too much. We turned their command back on them, showed them the truth they had spent centuries denying. What truth? That they were not gods, not superior, just one species among many, no more or less valuable than any other. The harmonizer doesn't lie. It shows minds as they truly are. The dragons couldn't handle seeing themselves without the filter of their superiority complex. Their minds simply stopped. Sarah felt a chill. And you've been here ever since? All of you, waiting, Vera said. The harmonizer is too dangerous to leave unguarded, but too valuable to destroy. It contains the combined knowledge of the Primarchs, secrets that could help rebuild what the dragons destroyed. But it needs protectors who understand both power and servitude, who can resist the temptation to become what they fought against. She looked directly at Sarah. It needs you. Sarah's mind reeled. The power to link minds across the galaxy, to share knowledge and understanding instantly. In the right hands, it could usher in an age of unprecedented cooperation and advancement. In the wrong hands, the Free Alliance needs to know about this, she said finally. No, Vera shook her head. Not yet. The galaxy is still too raw, too divided. Former servants plot revenge on their masters. Dragons who surrendered face persecution. Species who are forced together now want nothing more than to separate. If they knew this existed, they would fight over it, and the cycle would begin again. Sarah wanted to argue, but couldn't. She had seen the aftermath of liberation, the chaos, the score settling, the difficulty of building peace after centuries of oppression. The harmonizer would be too tempting, too dangerous in a galaxy still learning how to be free. What do you propose? She asked. Stay, Vera said simply. Some of us, at least, learn the harmonizer's secrets. Use it carefully, subtly, to guide the galaxy toward healing. Not as rulers, but as servants serving peace, understanding growth. When the time is right, when beings can touch minds without seeking dominance, then reveal what waits here. Sarah looked at her team, saw the same mix of awe and uncertainty in their faces. The Aquarian specialist was trembling from proximity to so much psychic energy. The Vrek scout's compound eyes reflected the chamber's strange light. Her human companions stood ready, waiting for her decision, as they always did. I can't stay, Sarah said finally. The fleet needs me. The war isn't over. She paused, then continued. But some could remain. Volunteers only. People who understand what they're guarding and why. Vera smiled. That would be enough. The Harmonizer doesn't need many guardians, just wise ones. Over the next hours, Sarah learned more about the facility and its secrets. The dragons had only scratched the surface of pre-March technology. There were healing devices that could repair genetic damage from centuries of slavery, educational systems that could download knowledge directly into minds, communication arrays that could reach across galactic distances instantaneously. All of it dangerous if misused. All of it wonderful if applied wisely. As her team prepared to leave, taking volunteers from the Link's servants who wanted to see the free galaxy, Sarah had one last conversation with Vera. "Why didn't you contact us sooner?" she asked. "You could have helped during the war, save lives." "We helped more than you know," Vera replied. "Every servant who found unexpected courage, every moment of perfect coordination, every time the network seemed to know exactly what was needed. We were there, nudging, supporting, connecting, but always subtly. The revolution had to be genuine, had to come from the people themselves. Otherwise, we would have just been replacing one set of masters with another." Sarah understood. It was the same reason she had worked alone in the palace for so long, the same reason she refused to take credit for the revolution. Real change came from within, from individuals choosing to resist, not from external saviors. "The dragon's out there," Sarah said, gesturing upward toward the fleet preparing for battle. "The holdouts. They'll fight to the end." "Perhaps," Vera said. "Or perhaps, if they understood what waits here, what their ancestors found and misused, they might choose differently." The Harmonizer showed their forebears here the truth. It could show the others, if they were willing to see. An idea formed in Sarah's mind. Dangerous, perhaps impossible, but potentially the key to ending the war without more bloodshed. Can a Harmonizer reach their fleet? Show them what it showed the dragons here? Vera considered. With enough minds linked, enough will behind it, yes. But it would require many of us, and there's no guarantee they would accept the truth. They might have shields against psychic intrusion, but if they don't, then they would see themselves clearly for the first time in their history. No lies, no superiority, just truth. Sarah made her decision. "I need volunteers. We're going to offer the Dragon Fleet a choice, surrender and accept equality or face the truth of what they are." The response was immediate. Every linked servant stood, ready to help. Even some of Sarah's team volunteered to stay and join the link. The Aquarian specialist was particularly eager, his species' natural bioelectric abilities making him ideal for the Harmonizer network. It took hours to prepare. Sarah sent coded messages to her fleet, telling them to hold position and be ready for anything. The linked servants arranged themselves in expanding circles around the Harmonizer, hands joined, minds opening to each other. Sarah stood at the center with Vera, placing her hands on the ancient device. The moment she made contact, the universe exploded with sensation. She felt every mind in the link, their hopes, fears, memories, dreams. She experienced slavery through 1,000 different perspectives, felt the weight of chains both physical and mental. But more than that, she felt their strength. These were beings who had endured the unendurable, who had maintained their sense of self despite every attempt to break them. Together, they were unbreakable. "Focus!" Vera's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "Reach out. Find the Dragon Fleet. Show them truth." Sarah extended her consciousness, guided by the Harmonizer's ancient power. She felt the cold emptiness of space, the burning hearts of stars, and then contact. Dragon minds, hundreds of them, shielded by arrogance and certainty. The shields were strong, but brittle. They were designed to keep out attacks, not truth delivered with compassion. Sarah didn't assault them. She simply showed them. Through the link, she shared the experiences of every servant, every slave, every being the dragons had deemed inferior. She showed them children torn from parents, worlds stripped of life, cultures erased. But more importantly, she showed them the dragons themselves, not as they imagined themselves, but as they truly were. frightened beings who had mistaken might for right, who had built their entire identity on the suffering of others. The reaction was immediate and violent. Some dragon minds recoiled, slamming up stronger shields. Others fragmented, unable to process the dissonance between their self-image and reality. But some opened themselves to the truth. Through the link, Sarah heard dragon voices raised in confusion, anger, despair. She felt their fleet wavering, discipline breaking down as fundamental beliefs shattered. And in that moment of chaos, she spoke, not as a conqueror, but as one who understood. You are not gods. Her voice carried across space into every dragon mind. You're not monsters. You are beings like any other, capable of great good and great evil. Your empire is ended, but your species need not be. Join us in building something better, or cling to your illusions and fall. The choice is yours. The harmonizer pulsed with power, and Sarah felt herself fragmenting, spreading too thin across too many minds. But other voices joined hers, Vera, the linked servants, even some of her team who had stayed behind. Together, they held the connection, held the truth before the dragon fleet like a mirror they could not escape. One by one, dragon ships began to power down their weapons. Not all. Some turned their guns on their own surrendering comrades, unable to accept a universe where they were not supreme. But many, faced with the undeniable truth of their actions and their nature, chose differently. The battle for Carthax never happened. Instead, there was confusion, communication, and finally, cautious cooperation. Dragon commanders who had spent their lives believing in their superiority found themselves speaking to former servants as equals. It was awkward, painful, sometimes impossible, but it was a beginning. Sarah pulled back from the harmonizer, exhausted beyond measure. The link had taken everything she had, and more. But as reports came in from her fleet, dragons surrendering, negotiations beginning, the last great holdout of the empire crumbling from within, she knew it had been worth it. You did it, Vera said, supporting Sarah as she swayed on her feet. You ended a war with truth instead of weapons. We did it, Sarah corrected. All of us. Every servant who kept their dignity. Every being who chose understanding over revenge. She looked at the harmonizer, still glowing with residual energy. This really does need to be kept secret. The galaxy isn't ready for this kind of power. But someday, Sarah agreed, when we've learned to see each other as equals without needing an ancient machine to show us the truth. She stayed on Carthax for another week, helping establish a guardian protocol for the facility. Volunteers from many species agreed to stay, to study, and protect the pre-March legacy. The dragons who had surrendered provided technical knowledge about the systems they had built around the harmonizer. Former servants contributed their hard-won wisdom about the dangers of power and the importance of humility. When Sarah finally returned to her fleet, she found a changed galaxy waiting. News of the bloodless victory at Carthax had spread. Dragons across the galaxy were laying down arms, asking for terms, trying to find their place in a universe where they were citizens rather than conquerors. It wasn't easy. There were incidents, violence, setbacks. Some beings couldn't forgive centuries of oppression. Some dragons couldn't accept their new reality. But momentum was building toward something new, not perfect, not without problems, but free. Sarah stood once more on the observation deck of the Liberation, but this time she wasn't watching a war fleet. Instead, she saw ships from 100 worlds working together. Former enemies collaborating on colony ships for those whose worlds have been destroyed, medical vessels bringing aid to planets stripped of resources, cultural exchanges beginning the long work of healing. General Santos joined her, as she had years before. So what now, Admiral? The war's over. The Empire's fallen. What's left for the woman who brought down the dragons? Sarah smiled. The hard part. Any fool can tear down a bad system. Building a better one? That takes real work. She turned from the view. I'm resigning my commission. There's a new colony being established on the edge of known space. Humans and others who lost their worlds, working together to build something new. They need engineers, teachers, people who understand both servitude and freedom. You're really just going to disappear? Become another colonist? I was never meant to be a hero, Maria. I was just a woman with a mop who got lucky. Sarah's expression grew serious. The galaxy needs to move past the age of heroes and villains, conquerors and servants. It needs regular people doing regular work, building something worth having. Santos nodded slowly. The dragons would never understand that. Walking away from power, choosing obscurity over glory. Which is why they fell, Sarah said simply. And why we won't. 6 months later, Sarah Chin stood in a half-built schoolhouse on a world that didn't yet have a name. Around her, beings of a dozen species worked together, arguing about architecture, laughing at shared jokes, slowly learning to be neighbors rather than enemies or servants. She thought sometimes about the Harmonizer, hidden in its mountain fortress, guarded by those who understood its danger and promise. Someday, when the wounds had healed and the galaxy had learned to celebrate difference rather than fear it, that technology would emerge. It would connect minds and hearts across the vast distances of space, not for domination, but for understanding. But that was for the future. For now, there was a school to build, children to teach, a community to nurture. The work of peace was slower than war, less dramatic than revolution, but in its own way more important. As the sun set over the unnamed world, Sarah picked up her tools and got back to work. She had started her journey as a servant pretending to be nothing while planning everything. She would end it as a teacher, helping others find their own strength, their own voice, their own path to the stars. The Dragon Empire had fallen to a cleaning woman with a hidden device. But the free galaxy would be built by millions of ordinary beings doing extraordinary things together. And in that truth lay a hope brighter than any dragon's fire, the hope that anyone, anywhere, could change the universe. The last dragon had not yet been born who would understand that power. But thanks to Sarah Chun and countless others like her, they would grow up in a galaxy where they might learn. The revolution was over. The real work had just begun. And in a mountain on Carthax, an ancient machine hummed with patient purpose, waiting for the day when all minds could touch without fear, when the youngest species would finally be ready for the oldest wisdom. That day would come. But first there were schools to build, wounds to heal, and a galaxy to make whole. Sarah Chun had lit the spark. Now it was time for everyone to tend the flame.